Welcome to Avoidant Decoded, where we uncover the hidden psychology behind avoidant behavior, emotional distance, and the patterns that shape relationships. If you've ever wondered what happens when you finally stop chasing an avoidant, stay with me because today we're going deeper than their silence. We're exploring what your absence can reveal. They say the most powerful kind of silence isn't the silence you hear around you. It's the silence that begins inside you when you finally stop caring about someone else's reactions. When the emotional attachment that once kept you focused on an avoidant person starts to disappear, the entire dynamic can shift. The connection that once consumed your attention no longer controls your emotional world in the same way. For a long time, they may have felt comfortable knowing you were still there. Even when their behavior hurt you, your attention gave them reassurance that they still mattered. It may not have been a deliberate attempt to control you. Your continued love, patience, and availability simply became something they could depend on, while avoiding the fears that came with genuine intimacy. But then you stop chasing, you stop explaining, you stop reacting to every period of silence. You stop trying to keep something alive that the other person keeps distancing themselves from. And when that happens, the familiar structure between you begins to collapse. What can disturb them isn't always the relationship ending itself. Sometimes it's the disappearance of the predictable emotional safety they had become used to. An avoidant person may genuinely want space while still wanting the comfort of knowing someone is waiting for them beyond that space. As long as you keep reaching out, hoping, forgiving, and showing that you care, they know the connection hasn't completely disappeared. But when you stop waiting, uncertainty takes its place. Suddenly, they don't know where they stand with you anymore. They can't assume you'll still be there whenever they decide to return. The distance they once used to feel safe can begin to feel like rejection. The silence they once controlled becomes something they can no longer control. And that's often when something unexpected happens. The person who once disappeared may suddenly find a reason to come back. Maybe they send a simple message. Maybe they bring up an old memory. Maybe they ask how you're doing. Maybe they mention something from the past that seems insignificant but carries emotional weight. Sometimes they even say something that sounds like closure while quietly reopening the door. From the outside, it can look like they have finally realized how much they care, but that isn't always what is happening. Sometimes, they simply need reassurance that they still matter to you. They may want to know whether you still think about them. They might test your reaction without openly asking for anything. They could become slightly warmer, mention memories you shared, hint at regret, or reveal a small amount of vulnerability that leaves you wondering whether they have finally changed. This creates one of the most confusing patterns in avoidant relationships. When you are deeply invested, they pull away. When you finally begin to detach, they move closer. But their return doesn't automatically mean they are prepared for a healthy relationship. Sometimes what brings them back is the realization that they may no longer have a guaranteed place in your life. Your attention once reassured them. Your patience told them they were still important. Your continued presence allowed them to avoid facing the possibility of genuinely losing you. Once that reassurance disappears, emotions they normally keep buried can start rising to the surface. They may suddenly sound softer. They might tell you they miss you. They may admit that they were scared, overwhelmed, confused, lonely, or simply didn't know how to handle the closeness between you. And because these words are so different from what you experienced before, they can hit you hard. You may think, maybe this is finally the person I was waiting for. And sometimes people really can change. But emotional vulnerability in one moment is not the same thing as lasting transformation. Someone can become emotionally open because they are afraid of losing you, without actually knowing how to build a stable relationship with you. They can miss your presence without knowing how to handle intimacy. They can fear losing you while still being frightened by the closeness they would need to maintain you. That's why behavior matters more than emotional speeches. When you genuinely pull back, they are forced to experience your absence rather than simply assume you are still emotionally available. They may begin wondering whether you've moved on, whether someone else has entered your life, or whether the connection they once took for granted is actually gone. And that's where the old cycle may try to restart. You chased, they withdrew. You waited, they returned. You opened yourself emotionally. They became overwhelmed and pulled away again. But when you step outside that pattern, something changes. Their usual emotional structure no longer works because you're no longer playing the same role. Their movement toward you may come from a complicated battle inside themselves. Part of them wants connection, while another part fears intimacy. When your absence becomes real, the fear of losing you can temporarily become stronger than the fear of getting close. That can bring emotions to the surface that they normally suppress. But once they feel certain that you still care, the urgency can disappear. The warmth fades. The vulnerability becomes less obvious. And suddenly, you're left wondering what happened to the person who seemed so open only a short time ago. This is why you should never mistake an emotional reaction for emotional growth. If someone truly wants to rebuild something with you, pay attention to consistency. Look for accountability. Look for changed behavior. Look for honest communication and a willingness to remain present even when intimacy feels uncomfortable. Real change isn't demonstrated by one emotional conversation. It's demonstrated through repeated choices. And your detachment should never be a trick designed to make someone chase you. It should be about reclaiming yourself. When you stop choosing confusion over peace, you stop participating in the cycle that kept you emotionally trapped. If they eventually return, the question is no longer, how can I make them stay? The better question is, have they actually changed enough to meet me where I am now? That is the real transformation. You no longer need their attention to prove your value. You don't need their return to validate what the connection meant. You don't have to interpret every emotional gesture as proof of love. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop feeding the pattern. Let your absence speak for itself. Let their behavior reveal what their words cannot. And most importantly, let your peace become more valuable than their uncertainty. Because when you stop trying to control whether someone returns, you finally regain control over your own life. And whether they come back or never do, that freedom belongs to you. Their softness can sometimes be less about building something new and more about calming their own fear. They may not be consciously trying to deceive you. They may simply need reassurance that they haven't completely disappeared from your emotional world. The feelings they express may be completely real in that moment, but real feelings do not always create real change. That's what makes their return so difficult to understand. They may not actually be returning to rebuild the relationship. Sometimes they simply want to preserve the emotional connection that once made them feel significant. They want confirmation that the bond hasn't completely vanished. Their tenderness can become a quiet test. Do I still affect you? And that can become a subtle form of control. Not obvious control, not aggressive manipulation. Something much quieter. A message filled with emotion. A memory from the past. A sudden confession. A warm moment that appears out of nowhere. Anything that causes you to lower the boundaries you worked so hard to build. But sometimes what draws them back isn't love. It's the discomfort of realizing that your life is continuing without them. When an avoidant person recognizes that they are no longer at the center of your emotional world, that can create an internal threat. Your silence becomes meaningful because they are no longer receiving the reactions they once expected. For a long time, they may have assumed that no matter how far they pulled away, you would eventually return. You would explain yourself. You would forgive them. You would wait. You would give the connection another chance. Then one day you stop. You stop trying to understand every silence. You stop proving that you care. You stop reaching towards someone who keeps stepping backward. And now they have to face the possibility that your emotional investment is no longer guaranteed. Sometimes this is where guilt enters the picture. Instead of directly facing their own role in what happened, they may say things that make you question yourself. I didn't think you'd move on so quickly. I thought what we had meant more to you. I just needed more time. I know I hurt you, but I was scared. These statements can sound vulnerable, and sometimes they are, but they can also plant doubt inside you. You begin asking yourself whether you were too harsh. Maybe you should have waited longer. Maybe you gave up too soon. Maybe you should have understood them more. Before you realize it, you're carrying emotional responsibility for a situation they also helped create. That's how guilt can keep an attachment alive. The relationship may be finished, the communication may have stopped, and yet you're still mentally connected because you're constantly questioning whether your decision was right. For someone who struggles with emotional vulnerability, this can become an easier way to remain significant without directly confronting their own behavior. They may know that your natural compassion makes you want to understand rather than judge. The same empathy that once made you patient can sometimes make it difficult for you to walk away. And pay attention to timing. Sometimes they don't come back when you're at your lowest. They come back when you're finally okay, when you've accepted what happened, when the emotional chaos has started settling, when you're beginning to feel peaceful again. That's when a message appears. Maybe it's an old memory. Do you remember that time? Maybe it's an apology mixed with an explanation. I know I hurt you. I just didn't know how to deal with what I was feeling. Or perhaps it's only a few words. I've been thinking about you. Those words can reopen doors you spent months trying to close. And because their feelings may actually be sincere, the situation becomes even harder to interpret. They may genuinely miss you. They may genuinely regret what happened. They may genuinely fear losing you. But missing someone is not the same as being prepared to build a healthy relationship with them. That distinction is crucial. An avoidant person can fear losing you while still fearing intimacy. They can want you nearby while becoming uncomfortable once you actually get close. They can hate the thought of being forgotten while simultaneously behaving in ways that push you away. So, the cycle repeats. Next, return, hope, confusion, withdrawal. And when guilt and nostalgia are added to the mix, you can become trapped without even realizing you're back inside the same pattern. You start questioning your progress. You wonder whether letting go was a mistake. You start believing that your boundaries are cruel simply because they no longer give someone unlimited emotional access to you. But protecting your peace is not cruelty. Moving forward is not punishment. And choosing yourself does not erase the fact that you once cared deeply. Sometimes shared guilt makes an ending easier for the other person because they don't have to fully confront their own contribution to the breakdown. If everything becomes our fault, they don't have to look closely at how their withdrawal, silence, or emotional unavailability affected the relationship. That shared blame can become emotionally comfortable. It allows them to avoid looking directly at themselves. And this is why dealing with avoidant behavior can feel like walking through emotional fog. You're constantly trying to determine what was genuine, what was fear, what was love, and what was simply a defense mechanism. But something important happens when you truly detach. The power dynamic changes. For a long time, they may have controlled the rhythm of the connection. They decided when closeness was acceptable. They decided when distance was necessary. You reacted to their movements while they remained protected behind emotional walls. But when you stop reacting, that strategy loses its effect. Their silence doesn't make you chase anymore. Their withdrawal doesn't send you into panic. Their distance no longer determines whether you have a good or bad day. And that can be extremely uncomfortable for someone who depended on that pattern to feel secure. Their influence was never necessarily about controlling your entire life. It may simply have been the certainty that they could disappear and still remain wanted. They could withhold affection and still receive attention. They could create distance and still know you were emotionally available. Once that certainty disappears, they have to face something they were trying to avoid all along: vulnerability. Their normal defenses stop working because you are no longer participating in the same emotional dance. That's when mixed signals may appear. A little warmth, followed by silence. A message, followed by withdrawal. A moment of affection, followed by emotional distance. Sometimes, these contradictions are a way of discovering whether they can still affect you. If they can still make you question yourself, they know they haven't completely lost their emotional influence. But you don't have to participate. Your goal isn't to make them powerless. Your goal is to stop measuring your worth through their behavior. A healthy connection doesn't require constant uncertainty. It doesn't need emotional chaos to feel exciting. It doesn't depend on one person constantly chasing while the other repeatedly retreats. If someone truly wants to rebuild something with you, eventually their actions will become clear. They will demonstrate consistency. They will accept responsibility. They will communicate honestly. And they will learn to tolerate the vulnerability that real intimacy requires. Until that happens, don't confuse emotional intensity with emotional growth. Your peace does not require anyone else's permission. When you stop dancing to the rhythm of someone's inconsistency, you discover something powerful. Their silence only controls you when you continue assigning meaning to it. You may also notice that after you detach, they begin reflecting your behavior. Suddenly, they appear distant too. They may act completely unaffected by your absence. They might even tell you that you've changed. You've become cold. You don't care anymore. You're not the same person. Be careful with those statements. They can trigger guilt and make you feel like you're doing something wrong simply because you finally stopped abandoning yourself. You may start explaining your boundaries. You may feel obligated to prove that you still care. And the moment you begin defending your decision to protect your peace, the old cycle can begin pulling you back in. The deeper truth is that their need for distance may never have been about wanting power over you. It may have been about protecting themselves from the frightening possibility of needing someone who could eventually leave. Color can feel safe. If they never become completely vulnerable, they convince themselves they can never be completely wounded. But your detachment removes that emotional safety net. Not because you attack them, not because you demand answers, not because you try to punish them. You simply stop participating. And suddenly they are left without the emotional structure they once depended on. So they may return to what feels familiar, unpredictability. They may pull you close with unexpected tenderness, make you feel understood again, and then retreat as soon as they sense that you're becoming emotionally open. Warmth, access, warmth again, text again, almost as if they're checking whether they can still disturb your emotional balance. But something else can happen inside them when you detach. Your attention had once acted like a mirror. Through your affection, they could feel wanted. Through your patience, they could feel forgiven. Through your continued presence, they could avoid confronting the fear that they might not be worthy of love. Then you stop, and the mirror disappears. What once felt like peaceful independence may begin to feel like emptiness. The distance that once made them feel safe may suddenly reveal how lonely they actually feel. And that's where the deepest contradiction appears. The intimacy they spent so much time avoiding may be exactly what they secretly wanted. They may have built their identity around independence. Somewhere along the way, closeness became associated with danger, and vulnerability became associated with losing control. Then you came into their life and became both comfort and threat. They wanted your warmth, but your emotional depth frightened them. They appreciated your consistency, but that consistency also highlighted their own inconsistency. Your love may have shown them parts of themselves they had spent years avoiding. The desire for connection, belonging, trust, safety, and emotional closeness. And sometimes, that is precisely why they pull away. The more deeply someone sees you, the harder it becomes to hide from yourself. Your care may have reminded them of wounds they didn't know how to process. Instead of moving closer and facing those emotions, they created distance. Not necessarily because they felt nothing. Sometimes they withdrew because they felt more than they knew how to handle. But when you finally stop caring, the distraction disappears. There is no one constantly reassuring them, no one waiting for their return, no one trying to decode every silence, no one rescuing them from emotions they need to learn to face themselves. At first, they may try to fill that empty space with things they can control: work, routine, friends, entertainment, new connections, constant activity, anything that keeps them from sitting alone with their thoughts. But distractions can't permanently replace emotional awareness. What they lost wasn't simply your physical presence. They lost the reflection your presence created. Your attention may have given them a certain image of themselves. They could feel important because someone cared. They could feel desirable because someone wanted them. They could avoid confronting certain emptiness because your emotional investment filled part of that space. When that reflection disappears, they may suddenly feel unsettled without understanding why. Their normal routines may not feel as satisfying. They may become restless. The silence may suddenly feel heavier, and they may start wondering why the person they assumed would always be there has finally stopped reaching out. That discomfort can create the urge to return. Maybe they send a message. Maybe they become unusually emotional. Maybe they suddenly act as though they've realized what they lost. But look beyond the emotional moment. Ask yourself one simple question. Are they returning because they are genuinely prepared to create something healthier, or because they want the old emotional mirror back? Those are completely different things. Someone can miss how you made them feel without becoming the person you needed them to be. They can crave your presence without knowing how to sustain intimacy. They can fear losing you while still being afraid of getting close. That's the painful contradiction of the avoidant cycle. They move toward connection when loneliness becomes unbearable, then retreat when intimacy becomes overwhelming. They seek closeness and then become afraid of the closeness they asked for. They run from intimacy because it exposes them, then run back toward connection because distance exposes their loneliness, and the cycle continues. But genuine detachment interrupts that pattern. You stop taking responsibility for regulating their emotions. You stop reassuring them that they matter. You stop trying to rescue them from feelings they need to learn to process on their own. Some people may respond by trying harder to pull you back into their emotional world. Others may withdraw even further. Either way, something has changed. You are no longer carrying the connection by yourself. And perhaps that's the greatest lesson your detachment can teach. You demonstrate a kind of love that doesn't chase, a kind of love that doesn't beg, a kind of love that doesn't sacrifice peace simply to keep someone else comfortable. Your silence isn't revenge. Your distance isn't punishment. Your boundaries aren't proof that you stopped caring. They are proof that you stopped abandoning yourself to maintain a connection that was costing you your peace. If they eventually reflect on what happened, they may understand what their behavior cost them. Not because you forced them to regret losing you, not because you deliberately tried to make them suffer, but because your absence removed the distraction. The guilt, nostalgia, sudden tenderness, mixed signals, and attempts to pull you back into emotional uncertainty may all come from fear. Fear of being forgotten, fear of being replaced, fear of confronting themselves without the reassurance your love once provided. But their fear is not yours to carry. You don't have to become their emotional mirror again. Your responsibility is to remain honest with yourself. Because when you stop chasing someone who keeps running, you don't simply walk away from a relationship pattern. You expose the pattern for what it really was. And eventually, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The greatest distance between you was never the physical distance. It was the distance they had created within themselves.